I suffer from horrible mouth ulcers. I mumble, and I'm not very articulate. I get my words in the wrong order. I'm an introvert. I'm badly organised. I'm forgetful. I do most things at the last minute. I laugh at my own jokes and nobody else does. I'm terrible at telling stories and anecdotes. I have no academic theological qualifications. My Bible study is not what it should be. I don't pray enough. I'm often a hypocrite, and at times I lack integrity. It's not a pantomime. But for some reason, God has chosen me to be a preacher, despite me. Now you'd think that the person who stands up to preach should have at least some kind of skill in preaching, but for some reason God has decided that I am one of the people that he would like to speak through. So I come to you really, as I always do as a preacher, in vulnerability. I know that I don't really have the skills or the personality to do it, and I may seem at times like I know what I'm doing, but deep down I don't. And I know that I don't have what it takes. And I have to rely mainly on, completely on God, and a little bit on a bit of fluke, and a little bit on the congregation being very forgiving. And but I recognise that preaching is a lot about vulnerability. That we come not as the greatest preacher in the world, the most accomplished person, but we come as someone with a personality, with our own flaws, with our own little idiosyncrasies and our own problems, and we present what God is speaking to us and through us. There's a preacher in the 19th century called Phillips Brooks. He was an American preacher, and he said this, and it's been repeated countless times: preaching is communication of truth through personality. He says preaching is the communication of truth by man to men, or women nowadays. Apparently they can. It's a joke. See what I mean? So, oh dear, it's going downhill already. So, and now my buttons aren't working. There we go. Okay, so we're all unique in our personality. Each of us are different in lots of different ways. But God wants to use us to communicate. And isn't that an amazing thing? That for some reason, whatever reason, God chooses to use people to speak. I'm often amazed in the Old Testament where God decides to bypass people and just speaks out loud anyway. And I often think to myself, wouldn't it just be easier if he's just said it out loud? Then we get it. But when you read through the Old Testament, you realise that most of the time people didn't get it and they needed somebody else to speak God's words for them. And this just seems to be the way that God works, that he uses personalities, he uses weak individuals to communicate what he wants to say. He incarnates himself amongst us, through us. That's incredible, isn't it? And when we preach, not only do we preach on top of our vulnerabilities, but we sometimes make ourselves vulnerable. Being at the front of a congregation is a very vulnerable place to be. We give ourselves to this art for hours, days, sometimes weeks, to perfect this thing that we're bringing to a congregation. We plough our time, our energy, and our prayer into this thing. And hopefully we believe that these words that we bring are God's words and that they'll change lives. And theology, really, for me, is the thing that changes lives. It's not just about knowledge up here. It's about a transformation of the heart. When we get to know God, when we study him, we're changed. Hopefully we become more like him. And then we take this thing that we've worked on, we've moulded and we've agonized over, and we present it to a congregation in weakness, really. And we sort of wait and see what happens. And that's where we have to leave it. We bring our sermon, we lay it in front of the people who are hearing it, and we have to leave it there. So we deliberately put ourselves in a very vulnerable place. So when we preach, there's a number of possible responses, and I just want to outline a few of the responses that I have experienced over the years, and they look like this. So, it comes in two parts. It does come in two parts. Here we go. When you're ready. There we go. Okay, so Part A, you thought it was brilliant. Can you just press the button for me, David? It's not working, this. You thought it was brilliant, so did they. That's a brilliant outcome, isn't it? So you get up and speak. You think what you've done is amazing, and everyone in the congregation also thinks it's amazing. You've got people falling on their knees in worship of God, and they're weeping. Lives are being changed, and you think to yourself, yes, I know, I did a good job. That's okay. Secondly, they didn't think it was brilliant, but you did. I've experienced this also. When I walk away from a sermon, I thought, I brought it then. But unfortunately, the people who I've spoken to haven't really got it. And really, I've probably just been preaching to myself while they've gone asleep. The third one is like this. You didn't think it was brilliant, but they did. Now, that is a weird one. Hands up if you've experienced that before. You brought a sermon, and it's like this withered, crippled little thing that you've probably put not much time into. And even before you preached it, you thought, this is going nowhere. And then you bring this horrible, wretched little piece of work before some people, and at the end, they come to you and say, that was the most amazing thing I've ever heard. And you just walk away thinking, it wasn't, it was rubbish. That's a difficult place to be. And finally, probably the toughest, you didn't think it was brilliant, neither did they. That's a place, really, we never want to be. Okay? So there's lots of different responses to sermons, aren't there? We lay ourselves open to the response of people. It's an interaction thing. It's about personalities. It's about people. We're trying to change the hearts of people so that they turn towards God. And so we have to work with their interactions and their responses. John Stott, in his book, I Believe in Preaching, it talks, obviously, it's a book about preaching. He says that preaching is not a monologue. It's not one person standing up and speaking. It's about a dialogue. We're engaged in a conversation. So I'm hoping now that as I'm preaching, as I'm speaking to you now, that you've got questions in your mind about what I might say. And hopefully what I say will be a response to the questions that I think you're asking. And really that's what this is about. When we preach, we're having a dialogue with people. And that might continue when you've finished. You might plant questions in their minds. You might anticipate the questions that they might have or the responses that they might have. You might get some positive feedback, which is lovely, isn't it? It's nice when people come up to you at the end and say, well done, what a great sermon that was. It's changed my life completely. I will never be the same again. But we've also laid ourselves open when we preach to some negative feedback. We have to be prepared for that somebody might not like what you say. Sometimes if we speak the word of God, it can be offensive. God doesn't always agree with us. Sometimes he has different ideas. Sometimes we have to challenge people's preconceptions, people's thoughts, and people's lifestyles. And that can be uncomfortable. And sometimes we might accidentally say something that isn't correct. And people will be offended. And I think actually one of the hardest responses that I've come across is when I've preached, and I think I've done an all right job. I walk out of the door, and I stand in the lobby, often of this church, and the response I get is nothing. That, I think, is the most difficult response to deal with. When you don't know how people felt about what you said. Maybe they're protecting you. Maybe they just fell asleep and didn't hear a word of it. That's quite difficult, isn't it? So we deal with the responses of people. We deal in conversation and dialogue. And preaching is all about this personal interaction between people. And we lay ourselves open to criticism, to pride, to all sorts of things. I want to relay to you, really, sort of paraphrase an Old Testament story. And it's one you may have heard before. And it's in 1 Kings chapter 18. It starts at verse 16. You might want to follow along, but I'm going to cut a few bits out. So a bit of background to this story. This is the story of Elijah on Mount Carmel. Elijah is the prophet of God. And most of the prophets of God, there were hundreds of them. But there were a succession of kings who had really oppressed the prophets of God, and they'd either killed them or the prophets were in hiding. So they'd run away. They were nowhere to be seen. And really, to all intents and purposes, Elijah was the last man standing. He was the last person who was really standing up for God and speaking for him. And at this time, there was a king in charge of Israel called Ahab, and he was married to a queen called Jezebel. And they had led the nation of Israel to abandon God's law and to worship the Baals and the Ashtaroths, which were these foreign gods. So Elijah comes to the king, and he demands a face-off between him and the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Asherah. And he says to them, get them together on Mount Carmel, and we are going to sort this out once and for all. We're going to deal with this, and we're going to find out which God is real. And he gets them all together. There's 950 of these prophets and one prophet of God, Elijah. And so he says to them on the mountain, I don't know how he did it, whether he had an intricate ancient PA system or whether he just shouted really loud, I don't know. He says, how long will you waver between two opinions? If Yahweh is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him. I think that's the basis of a great sermon, isn't it? How long will you waver between two opinions? You've got to make a choice here. If God's real, follow him. But if the gods of our culture are real, follow them. But I think you'll find that God is real. And so you have a choice. Elijah gets them to build an altar. They bring stones up the mountain. They bring 2 bulls, and they place one of them on the altar. And he says to them, don't set fire to this bull. We're going to do a little experiment. It's a great visual aid here that he does. So he says, you do your sacrifice, I'll do mine, and we'll see what happens. He says, then, you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of my God, the Lord, the God who answers by fire. He is God. What a great truth. The God who answers by fire. He says to them, if God's real, he will answer. If there is a God in Israel who is all-powerful, you need to choose him because he will answer you. He is God. And so, because he's a gentleman, Elijah lets the prophets of Baal go first. Maybe they win the coin toss. I don't know. But he says, we're told that the prophets of Baal go first. They bring their sacrifice onto the altar. They lay it on top. And we're told they shout out from morning till noon, oh, Baal, answer us. Nothing happens. They dance around the altar desperately, frantically cutting themselves with swords and spears until the evening. Hours and hours and hours pass and nothing happens. There is silence from their God. And at one point in the story, we find that Elijah comes to them and says, what's going on here? Why isn't your God answering? Maybe he's on holiday somewhere. But actually, if you look at the Hebrew, I'm told, what he actually says is, maybe your God has gone to the toilet. And he can't answer at the moment. That's interesting, isn't it? So he comes to them and says, your God isn't answering. And they start to cut themselves. And so eventually they give up. It says there was no response, no one answered, no one paid attention. And if Elijah was preaching today, I think he would make a point about the culture that we live in. That the gods of our culture are silent. They really have nothing to offer. They have no answer to the big questions of life. But there is a God who answers by fire. And so it's Elijah's turn. He rebuilds the altar, he rearranges the wood, and he brings his bull and lays it on top. And then he says to the people, okay, go down to the valley, go and get some water and tip it on top of the altar. Soak it. Go and do it again. 3 times they fill up these pitchers of water and they throw it onto the altar. In fact, they build a trench around the altar and fill that with water too. And so Elijah comes and he prays to God. He says, answer me, O Lord, answer me. So these people will know that you, O Lord, are turning their hearts back again. God is in the habit of turning people's hearts back to him. And in our culture, we need to be aware that that is still his will for us. As the church, he wants to use us to turn people's hearts back to him. That's what he wants to do in our generation. And then what happens is the fire of God falls on this altar. And we're told that it evaporates all the water. It laps it up. It burns up the offering. It burns up the wood. It even burns up the stones, and the water disappears. There is no doubt in anyone's mind on that mountain that the God who answers by fire, he is the Lord. He gives his message in humility, and God acts. Now that is a great visual aid. Fire hazards galore, but we can deal with that. You know, there's no prayer ministry here or a nice cup of coffee after the service. In fact, his response time to this little sermon is to take them to the bottom of the mountain and slaughter them, which is an interesting way of finishing a sermon, isn't it? And I really don't recommend that. But by all means, pray for people. If they fall over and lie on the floor, slain in the spirit, that's okay. But please, don't kill them. They may have a little bit of criticism, but, just hold back. I know the temptation is there. The next thing we find is this. The king Ahab, it says this, verse 42, Ahab went off to eat and drink, but Elijah climbed to the top of Mount Carmel and put his face between his knees. That's an odd response for someone who's just delivered a message from God with that kind of authority. He runs away and he puts his face between his knees. This is what we call nowadays the preacher's hangover. You see, it's not the end of the story. The king is just happy going along with his life. He's been delivered this message about the way that he's been living his life, the way that he's been leading people, and God has shown up in power. And Elijah has delivered this message. He's preached to the people. He's shown them that God is the Lord. And sometimes after a sermon, all we want to do is hide. All we want to do is put our face between our knees and get away from everyone. I know that's my response sometimes. I've given this thing that I've worked on for hours and days and sometimes weeks, and I come in vulnerability and I give this message, and often what I want to do is just hide. I don't want to hear people's feedback. I don't want to hear what they have to say. I just want to get out of there. They can go and have their lunch. They can go and eat and drink. But I feel like the weight of the world is on my shoulders, and I just want to leave. But this isn't the end of the story. In fact, in chapter 19, it gets worse for Elijah. We see in chapter 19 that Queen Jezebel decides that she wants him dead. Now, I've had some criticism, but I've never had a death threat. So I feel like I'm quite blessed in this. Nobody's ever sent me any parcel bombs or anything like that. They don't want me dead, so I think I'm getting away with it. So, when I first started preaching, when I moved to Pinner in Middlesex. So we lived, just after Emma and I got married, and we lived in this little cottage in the grounds of a church. And they'd heard that I preached from time to time. So they invited me to preach for their Mothering Sunday service. And I thought, there's a great opportunity here. I don't really know this church very well, but I'm living in their grounds, so I sort of owe them something. And so I agreed to do it. And I thought and I prayed, and I thought, well, what's the one thing I should say to this church? I knew a little bit about the church. I knew that it was struggling, and people weren't really coming apart from the real kind of people who'd come for years. And I really felt that God was saying that he wanted me to preach on Hannah in the Old Testament, this woman who was a barren mother, and God gave her this child, Samuel, and she'd prayed for years, and she wept before God. And I preached this sermon, and I remember saying some quite difficult things for this church, and bearing in mind there were Cubs and Scouts and Brownies in the audience, in the congregation at the time, and so they were hearing all this as well. And I basically said, if one of the answers to barrenness as a Christian is intimacy. Babies only come from intimacy. And if you want to have babies, you need to get intimate. And I think I was a little more candid than I should have been. But it's all right. I don't think the Cubs quite understood what I was saying. But I could see some looks on some old ladies' faces that meant, just shut up a little bit. So I gave this sermon. I really felt this was the message that God wanted me to bring. And anyway, as is the custom of a lot of churches, we went for tea and coffee in those little green cups afterwards in the church hall. And And a lot of people came over to me and said, well, thank you very much for that message. Thank you very much. And one lady came over to me. I can remember her very distinctly. She was wearing one of those old lady coats and old lady shoes. And I think you've got a picture of what she looked like in your mind right now. And she came over to me, and she looked very nice. And, she was smiling at me, and she came over and she said, thank you for your sermon. It was very entertaining. And at that moment, something inside me died. I felt anger. I felt frustration. I felt like I'd wasted my time because I knew that I didn't want to just bring a sermon that was entertaining. I didn't want people just to enjoy themselves. In fact, I try my best to make sure people don't enjoy themselves during my sermons. But she came to me, and the only thing she could think of saying was, that was very entertaining. And it crushed me. I went home disappointed, feeling like I'd achieved nothing. And I know now, probably, that she meant no malice at all in those words, that she was trying to encourage me. But she said something that crushed me. Sometimes the most innocent feedback can hurt us. It can feel like criticism. It can feel like a death threat. So Elijah's response when he gets this death threat from the queen is not to confront it, but to run away. He runs off into the wilderness. He says he wants to die. He should have just stuck around, shouldn't he? So he runs off to Mount Horeb, and God tells him to go and stand on the mountain of the Lord because the Lord is about to pass by. And we know this story very well, don't we? He stands in the desert, in a cave, and we find out that there's a massive wind, a hurricane that shatters the rocks. We're told the Lord was not in the earthquake. And there was there's an earthquake, a wind, and a fire. And God is not in the earthquake, the wind, and the fire. He's not in the chaos and the noise and the destruction. But suddenly, in the midst of the desert, there's a whisper, a gentle whisper. And God was in the whisper, in the quiet. Do you know, I have a 4-year-old MacBook, and I love Apple products, but my MacBook is starting to slow down, as I'm sure you've experienced with the old clicker today. It's had a few problems, and it frustrates me, and I don't know why I've done nothing about it. I've just let it go on. And the thing is, when I press the off button on my MacBook, it gives me 4 options. It says, do you want to restart, sleep, cancel, or shut down? And invariably what I do at the end of an evening, when I've been working, I've got all these windows open, is I should press shut down. What I do is I press sleep because it's easier. It shuts down more quickly. And the screen just goes off, everything's fine. What I find is the next morning, the problems haven't gone away. It's still slow. It's still difficult. I have that spinning beach ball of death going around on my screen on everything that I click. And but I know that if I was just to click shut down, things would get better. When we take time to listen to the still small voice of God, when we take time to shut down, to reboot, that's when things start to change. It's too easy, isn't it, just to go into sleep mode. When we've preached, when we're feeling vulnerable, when we've had negative criticism, to just go home, go to bed, and hope the next morning everything will be fine. It won't be. Because there are things in each of us that we need to deal with. We need to take time away to deal with those things, because it's not actually about the people who are giving the criticism. The issue lies with what's inside of us. We must give ourselves to God in His presence, to find rest in Him at His pace, even amongst the chaos, the earthquakes, the wind and the fire in our lives. You know, preaching opens up a world of possibilities. And I want to leave you with a quote from Rob Bell from his series, Poets, Prophets and Preachers. And he says this: when you give a sermon, you open yourself up to misinterpretation and confusion and anger and ignorance and fear and jealousy and opinions and evaluation and critique and agendas and baggage and convictions and projections, and the possibility of truth and light and hope and repentance and desire and compassion and longing and revolution and confession and inspiration and comfort and solidarity and salvation and resurrection. And that is why we preach. So let's preach with conviction. Let's preach with our personalities and our vulnerabilities. But let's not neglect the God whose voice is heard in the whisper. Thank you.